Okay, well, thank you very much for coming, everybody. So this is the first in our external speakers series this year that Max Schultz and I co-organised. So thank you, everybody, for coming. This is the first one we're doing on Zoom, so hopefully everything will run smoothly. We have lots of help, lots of people co-hosting, so thank you to you as well. So I'm extremely pleased and thrilled to be able to welcome Dr. Nükhet Varlik to talk to us this evening. Dr. Varlik is Associate Professor of History at the University of South Carolina and Rutgers University-Newark. And she is an historian of the Ottoman Empire, interested in disease, medicine, and public health. She is the author of Plague and Empire in the Early Modern Mediterranean World, the Ottoman Experience, 1347 to 1600, which came out in 2015, and editor of Plague and Contagion in the Islamic Mediterranean, 2017. Her new book project, Empire, Ecology and Plague, Rethinking the Second Pandemic, circa 1340s to circa 1940s, examines the 600-year Ottoman plague experience in a global ecological context. In conjunction with this research, she is involved in developing the Black Death Digital Archive and contributing to multidisciplinary research projects that incorporate perspectives from paleogenetics, ancient DNA research in particular, bioarchaeology, disease ecology, and climate science into historical inquiry. She's the editor of the Journal of the Ottoman and Turkish Studies Association. And she very, very recently, I think it was this week or late last week, there was news circulated on social media by Monica Green that Monica Green and Nükhet Varlik are going to be working on a project together, looking further into these areas that's been recently funded by Villanova, which is wonderful. And we're super, super lucky to have Dr. Varlik here because she's been giving papers absolutely everywhere and really been in demand because of the coincidence of her research topics and what we're living through right now. So I will hand over to you, Dr. Varlik, and I will just say for questions, please feel free to put a question in the chat or at the end to use the blue hand function to raise your hands. And I would like to ask a graduate student or multiple graduate students to ask the first question. So I'm going to give you the space to do that. And I'll hand over to Dr. Varlik now. Thank you very much.
All right. Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Let me share my screen before we start. All right. Thank you for this lovely introduction, and thank you all for joining us this evening. It's a pleasure to be here. This is something we had been planning for an event that was supposed to be in person, but circumstances did not make it possible. So I am hoping that I will distract you a little bit from our current political uncertainty by a historical uncertainty. So what I'm going to talk about, the entire phenomenon of thinking about the end of pandemics, is again just present something, a whole set of uncertainties. So let's see what we can do as historians to contribute to these questions. So some of the things that I will be talking about today is, first of all, and obviously, is the current pandemic context that we're in, but also from the point of view of a historian of past pandemics, just thinking about this moment as an important, of course, moment, but also as a moment that kind of opens up new possibilities of thinking about the past and questioning what we think we know about past pandemics, and also kind of developing historical insights that might be applicable to where we are today. So that's what I will try today. And I will also address the problem of the pandemic experience as a totality of experience that covers multiple actors, multiple centuries, multiple locations, but also multiple ecological phenomena. So I will address the issue of the emergence of diseases, spread and persistent extinction of pandemic diseases. More importantly, I will also talk about the the idea of pandemics as processes, not events, and processes that are, ecological in nature. And then hopefully that will take us to problematizing end of pandemics. Like, what does it mean to think about the end of a pandemic? How can we understand it or imagine it as a historical phenomenon? And then I will also address some of the narratives that are related to past pandemics, especially focusing on the end of pandemics. And the examples, and I will try to draw from different past pandemics, but I will be mainly drawing from plague pandemics, and especially the second pandemic, and I will talk about what it means in just a moment. So, all right, this is where we are today. In fact, the numbers are increasing, and this is just a snapshot, just before we started actually this afternoon, from the Johns Hopkins University tracking system, and this is a very helpful resource that has been at least helpful for me to get a sense of the development of the pandemic since the beginning. It's possible to see country by country the number of cases, the number of deaths, number of hospitalizations, but also, just generally speaking, the epidemiological sense, getting a sense of the epidemiology of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we see here is, of course, clearly we know that this is something global, right? Just as a reminder of a pandemic. And also we are now kind of reckoning with the idea that this is not something that comes and goes quickly, or that will not just magically disappear, as it had been claimed several times. But this is a process. All right. And in fact, just yesterday, we've had a very steep surge in the case of numbers globally. So, but this is like, if you want to kind of focus on epidemiology, right? This is, at least one way of thinking about the pandemic. It's just one metric, right? Looking at the number of human cases, positive tested cases, or deaths, right? That's one way of thinking about it. But of course, there are other ways of thinking about the pandemic or understanding the pandemic. You can also trace the virus itself and the different mutations and different variations, different strains of the virus circulated across the world, and kind of trying to get a sense of its spread and development. So all of these are different ways of understanding the pandemic. But neither the biomedical approach, nor the genomic approach, nor the epidemiological approach will be enough to make sense of the totality of experiences that we call a pandemic, right? My own personal experience of the pandemic will be different than someone else's, right? One region, one country, one state, one city, as we know now, kind of might be experiencing a surge while others, are not. So, depending on season, depending on temperature, depending on the behavior of the pathogen, depending on the how people behave, right? Whether you're wearing a mask or doing social distances, for all sorts of reasons. Now we know that pandemics are not simple phenomena that can be understood or studied or imagined or measured on the basis of a single discipline, right? You can approach from an epidemiological approach. You can do all the numbers that will tell you something. You can approach from a genomic approach and trace the pathogen itself. That will tell you a different story. Or you can approach from the society of like the more individual or social experiences. That will also give you a perspective. So in my own work, I prefer to use the term experience as something that kind of, I hope, encompasses also these different aspects of a pandemic as something that will allow us to think about or imagine as a historical phenomenon, imagine this process as comprehensively as possible. So I'll be using this term a lot. So how do pandemics end? Right? Nobody, of course, knows. And this is a piece that I recently wrote for the conversation. And in it, basically, I argued that, pandemics, of course, at some point end, or like they kind of recede, they diminish, they retreat, whichever way you want to call it. but the pathogen, the disease-causing pathogen, actually never disappears, almost never disappears, right? Especially, if you want to create a narrative that argues that disease pathogens will disappear as a result of human intervention, that narrative is not supported by historical evidence. So just to give an example, when we look at the entire human history, you have, of course, a number of diseases that were introduced to the humans most of the time from animal hosts, and they come to stay with us. Some of the very older examples include diseases like malaria, right? Almost as old as humanity. But more recent examples include those diseases that we have as a society inherited or acquired, with the Neolithic revolution, with animal domestication and farming and agriculture, and so urban life. So those are, some of those older diseases, and plague is one of them, have been with us for at least 10,000 years. But we have newer pathogens that had been introduced to the human environment, and so they keep adding to the larger repertoire of bacteria, viruses, and parasites that we continue to live with. So in that sense, this pandemic, and of course we're dealing with an emerging infectious disease with the novel coronavirus, like all the emergent infectious diseases that we've had at some point, or we acquired at some point in history, this one also is something that will very likely stay with us for a very long time. So the term that epidemiologists use, the term eradication, means that disease pathogen does not exist in the world anymore, in like no human hosts or new animal hosts, right? But that, the stage of eradication of it is, it's almost impossible. So the only infectious disease that we've successfully managed to eradicate entirely by human efforts is smallpox. Smallpox is a viral condition, and it is something that World Health Organization launched a massive campaign worldwide, and mass vaccination paid off. But smallpox is the only example. And if you want to think about another disease, rinderpest is a cattle plague, is another animal disease that had been exterminated, eradicated. But otherwise, all the other diseases we've had in the history of humanity, they are still with us. So history, at least here, can be a source of guidance for us to think about the long-term process of how these pathogens will behave. Perhaps, at some point, eventually, hopefully, it will stop being a public health emergency. It will stop being a pandemic, so to say, but it will still continue in one part of the world because it can take an endemic form that can continue in like sustained human-to-human transmission in some part of the world. But of course, if there is transmission in one part of the world, we're not safe, so it can get transmitted to other areas. So in that sense, if you want to think about the big picture of what happens to disease pathogens in the long term, we know that coronavirus, the COVID-19, will not disappear, right? So that's what we know. Let's hope, it won't be the case, but very, very likely this will be the case. So what I found interesting, and just very briefly, I would like to mention that I wrote that piece for the conversation, and I experienced something very interesting because it was read more than 300,000 times. And it was translated to all the world languages. And it was kind of surprising to me that it was, circulated that much. But at the same time, it made me realize how important a historian's insight can be in a moment like this. Because, well, with COVID-19, we're really experiencing something that is unprecedented in living memory, right? I mean, the closest examples are the ones that the Asian flu or the Hong Kong flu. Those terms are, have been used in the scholarship in 1957, 58, and 1968 and 69. So those are perhaps the closest examples in time, comparable examples, but even for anyone, under the age of 65 are not things that they, no one can remember. I mean, it's like, given that we have less than 10% of the world's population is above the age of 65 right now, it is not something that is in our immediate memory, right? So we turn to older diseases, usually so-called the Spanish flu, the pandemic influenza of 1918, 1920 has come up a lot during the early stages of the pandemic, at least as something in comparison. We still come across a lot in popular media as something that could be compared to our current pandemic, as well as other older pandemics. But really, there is nothing in our recent memory to compare it. And so perhaps that's the reason history becomes relevant in our present moment. So, but at the same time, as I try to put it in the earlier part of my talk, I mean, of course, as a historian, I understand that this kind of, the present moment is kind of helping me to rethink the past, but at the same time, like thinking about the past as, to offer insights for the present moment. And so I would like to emphasize two key issues here. So one is that I think it's really important to think of pandemics as processes, not events. And the second thing is, even though it's obvious, but I would like to state the obvious, pandemics are global phenomena and they must be studied as such, right? So for the first one, I mean that, that pandemics are not events, but as processes. I'd like to say a few things on this because our entire historical scholarship, but even our policymakers and also in popular imagination, we want to think of a pandemic like an event, like the kind of historical events that we historians, like to kind of narrow down to a certain limited time. Like we want to think of pandemics perhaps like war, like some other form of natural disasters, something, or as revolutions, or something like an event that we can pinpoint in space and time. But with pandemics, it doesn't work like that. And in fact, it kind of misleads the misguides our thinking. I mean, just as a reminder, just, we know how Trump and other leaders in other parts of the world just wanted to treat COVID-19 as something that would just disappear on its own because of this thinking, like this long-term pattern of thinking of pandemics as kind of as an external event that happens to you, but as something that can be that can something I mean disappear. But like if you want to think of it as a process, you want to understand, imagine it along these lines, I think it's more helpful for also for policymakers to develop the policies that would make sense in those along those lines. And also that pandemics are global phenomena. I mean, yes, it sounds like it's, I'm stating the obvious, but when we look at history of pandemics, then we see that we don't study them as global phenomena, even though a pandemic may have affected a very large part of the world, and yet we are focused on a very limited geography and time period. So let me just talk a little bit about plague as an example here, but then I would like to go back to other like historical discussions, right? So plague, all right, so plague is a bacterial infection, it's not viral, so I'm not trying to draw a comparison here to COVID-19. I am only presenting plague as an example here because it's a good case to think about the process, right? And plague is a disease of rodents, and other mammals, not a human disease, but it is transmitted to humans. And it is not contagious in that sense. It's not a disease that is transmitted from person to person. So it's not COVID-19, it's not flu, so it's entirely different. So, you know, I'm not trying to draw the analogy with respect to the biological mechanism of the disease, but as for its like historical value. So for plague, and again, it's something that we kind of tend to think that it's, you know, it's a medieval disease or it's an extinct disease. You know, by all means, it's the contrary. It's not an extinct disease. Plague is still well and alive. It's still with us in the world. And here on this map, we're looking at least, you know, parts of the world that we still have plague as kind of endemic to certain societies. Though, you know, the term endemic is not the right one here because plague is not hosted by humans. We use the term enzootic, which means it is endemic to animal populations, right? So in especially the Western and Southwestern US, you still have cases of human plague, right? Because it's in the wild rodents in nature, right? And if you get into close contact with those animals, it is possible to contract the disease. The same applies to, you know, parts of Central Asia, parts of Africa. Madagascar, of course, is, you know, as a hot spot. There was a major epidemic of plague a couple of years ago. So these are at least some of the places that we see on the map that plague still continues. It's not a pandemic per se right now, but it is a disease that still exists in the environment. So this is what I mean that we want to think about it as a process. It doesn't disappear. It kind of takes root in nature and it's still there, right? And it cannot be eradicated. And just as a reminder, plague has probably been with us for the last 5,000 years. And we claim to, you know, have a good control of, you know, a good sense of, you know, vaccination, antibiotics, you know, public health and all that. Plague is still there. So yeah, so these areas are kind of what is called the plague foci, so the areas in which it naturally occurs, right? And again, epidemic in Madagascar in 2017 was one of the you know, the most dramatic recent examples. And this is kind of the situation that, just to give you an idea, I mean, like, you know, places like Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, you know, California, all the way to Oregon, Washington State, you still have plague in the US. So, so if we still have plague, a disease that is 5,000 years old in very different parts of the world today, how do we study the history of that disease? This is a paper that was just published, I think, last week by paleogenomics scholars. And it is, you know, at least, you know, it's one of the examples of trying to understand the spread of plague in the past. So I would like you to pay attention to this map. And here I'm trying to use this as an example to kind of point out or underline how important historical narratives are in our current thinking today, in our current scientific thinking, right? So this paper was published in one of the most prestigious science journal, PNAS, and by, you know, some of the leading paleogeneticists in the world. And this is what we're looking at. And so I think, you know, okay, let's just say that the arrows are making a very strong statement here, right? That plague is spreading to Europe from the Eastern Mediterranean, from the Ottoman Empire. And of course, you know, as a historian of plague in the Ottoman Empire, I find this extremely offensive because it is not based on like accurate historical information, accurate historical analysis, but even like the genetic side is also shady. But these papers are, you know, keep getting published. It's out there, and it kind of shapes how we think about the past. So it's actually misleading and dangerous because it kind of perpetuates some older narratives that I will be talking about. let me just, walk you through some of the examples that how this thinking of past pandemics, especially with respect to plague, as something that has a homeland, that has an origin, but then it kind of travels, right? So this is from a paper that was published, and again, in a science journal in 2015. Here you see the homeland of plague is depicted as Central Asia, but then plague, the bacteria are somehow like so smart. They know the way. They march in a single line west, right? Disease always comes from the east, and it somehow goes west, right? Again, just, I'm caricaturizing it now, but I think you will agree that at least some of the arguments that you will see, I mean, these big arrows, right, in science papers, and for some reason, like the middle area that we look at here, Anatolia is the Mediterranean, Black Sea, North Africa, this at least, historically what was the Ottoman Empire seems to be like a problematic area they don't know how to engage with. In any case, this is from a paper published in 2014. Again, just making these big claims. Historians have talked about, in various contexts that, the Black Death coming from China to Europe and all that, those are historical narratives, right? I would like to underline it. And it's important. It matters, right? And some of it, some of these arguments are made on the basis of historical material. Some of them are made on the basis of human genetic material. And just as a quick parenthesis here, now it's possible to use human remains, skeletal remains, especially human teeth. And then from dental pulp, scientists can extract and amplify the remnants of the plague bacterium. So it's possible to understand, for example, if an individual died of plague or not in the past. So this is possible. So most of these arguments that you see here that I mentioned in the science journals, they're based on like 1 or 2 genome, but then you have these huge arrows that show how diseases move. And of course, as a historian, it makes me very uncomfortable. How can you make an argument on the basis of 1 genome of something that just historically doesn't make sense? But in any case, let's just treat them as historical narratives. And again, even though they're scientific hypotheses in a way, I think they are fed by, or they're kind of informed by historical narratives. So that's actually what I want to get at. All right, so another example here, this time by a historian, 2004, Ole Benedict Tau's major work on the history of Black Death. And again, here we see plague as something almost exclusively as a European phenomenon, right? So we're talking about here the Black Death, traditionally dated to 1346 to 1353, mid-14th century. But again, I'm sure this will be familiar to most of you that the Black Death is almost exclusively discussed and understood as a European phenomenon, as something that transformed European society, as something that had lasting impact on European society. But as a historian of plague of the Ottoman Empire, I don't want to accept these narratives, right? Plague was not an exclusively European phenomenon, but unless we kind of, expand our geographic and temporal definition of what we're looking at, we're not gonna understand what's going on. Here on this map, you have some arrows suggesting the possible trajectories of plague spread, but again, as you see, it's only Europe and its surroundings, and the surroundings of Europe basically matters only so much as they kind of inform our understanding of European history, right? And in fact, I'd like you to take a look at this map instead. So here, the mid-14th century Black Death, plague, supposed to have been transmitted in this area, but also I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that almost everything outside of Europe's immediate vicinity is kind of blank, right? No data, nothing, right? I mean, what do we do with this map? How do we read this? How do we understand this, right? And so I'd like you to pay attention to this map for 1 second. And this is, even though this is not a map of the spread of the Black Death, this map is showing us showing us how connected the world was in the mid-14th century. And the world, I think I should just explain a little better here. Of course, we're not talking about the New World. So this is Afro-Eurasia, the old world. And the circulation of plague was pretty much limited to the old world before the 19th century. So it's only in the late 19th century that we see it spreads to Australia, to the Americas. It's a more recent phenomenon. But until then, the entire late medieval and early modern period, the circulation of plague took place within Afro-Eurasian region. So if we want to think of plague as something that only circulated in and out of Europe and its immediate surroundings, we are probably missing a large degree of connectivity across the entire Afro-Eurasia, right? And on this map, we're looking at all the different routes that connected the urban areas, and the orange dots represent urban centers, and the more connected an urban center was to others, the larger the dot. So it's basically, it's showing us how connected the urban areas of the late medieval world was. So I would argue that if we're only looking at Europe and trying to understand, we're probably looking at a very tiny portion of what was going on. In fact, we miss a very large portion of this phenomenon. So as I tried to point out earlier, so yes, thinking about pandemics as phenomena, processes is important, but we also need to keep in mind they are global, or at least in this case, hemispheric phenomena, right? And also you have to expand your geographic definition of the pandemic, but you also need to expand your temporal definition of the pandemic. So if you only look at the 14th century, mid-14th century Europe, you're only going to get, again, you're going to get this, right? Just the tip of the iceberg, but you're still missing out on multi-century development of this pandemic. So this map that we're looking at, in fact, this is forthcoming. This is Monica Green's forthcoming work in the HR. In fact, it's making revolutionary claims in the sense that, we all thought that the Black Death was something that started in the mid-14th century. This actually, this research pulls the beginning date of the pandemic to the early 13th century, and making this claim that, and on the basis of not only historical, but also genetics research, that the point of origin of the pandemic probably is somewhere in Central Asia, in the highlands of Kyrgyzstan, and then in multiple waves or in multiple trajectories, it kind of spreads to different parts of the world, and it just takes a life of its own over time and kind of develops in different ways in the 13th century. And of course, the movement of Mongol armies and the Mongol Empire, this is also something that needs to be taken into consideration. So the blue arrows here that we're looking at just shows us a possible directions of spread of early Black Death, or we might use the term second pandemic. It may sound as a technical term, but let's just say that the Black Death is usually understood as an event, right? And let's replace it with the second pandemic as a phenomenon, as a process. And by second pandemic, it's only the conventional term used to refer to this as a second pandemic, because the first historically known or historically documented pandemic refers back to just neonic plague. So the convention that we use, it's the second pandemic. It's not second, it's just a very colonial actually way of thinking about pandemics, but let's just leave it at that. So it is not something that happens once, right? It's something that keeps occurring, right? It's in the nature of emerging infectious diseases. They come to an area, they spread to an area, they kind of recede over time, but then they come back again. So, and just, you can think of it as waves, you can think of it as a forest fire, you can think of it in all the different ways or metaphors that you want to use, but it keeps coming back. So how do we think of these epidemic diseases or pandemic diseases as processes that have played a role in the long-term history of societies? And very quickly about my own research, my book covered the history of the second pandemic in the Ottoman Empire, from the Black Death to the end of the 16th century. In it, on the basis of historical data and a number of other disciplines, I trace the circulation of plague and look at the impact of plague on Ottoman society. So these are some of the kind of like the possible trajectories along which plague spread in the Eastern Mediterranean, the part of the world that I study as a historian. And one of the most important findings, at least in my research, the contribution of my research was to show basically that plague did not always travel from the Ottoman Empire to Europe, had been conventionally maintained both by early modern actors but also modern historians, but that especially in the 14th and 15th century, plague actually arrived at the Ottoman Empire from Europe, right? So kind of shifting these perspectives that you might be wondering, like, why is it important if it comes from the East or the West? I mean, it's a disease. It doesn't have any boundaries. Like, we're talking about a bacterium, we're talking about rodents, rats. Like, why does it matter, where it comes from, where it goes? It matters because the historical narratives are really what we need to deal with, because they shape the way we think about it. So again, in my research, because I was able to address this question that it actually does not come from the Ottoman Empire to Europe, and then it just opened up a whole sorts of possibilities, or at least new questions, then, oh, if it did not come from the Ottoman Empire, then maybe we need to think about the kind of ecological processes by which it was maintained in the natural environment of Europe, right? And again, this is an ongoing debate. Some of the scientists that I mentioned earlier, they still want to have those big arrows. But others are actually thinking about both historians and paleogeneticists are thinking about the possibility of plague persistence in Europe and looking at the role of some rodents here. We're looking at alpine marmots as possible plague hosts in Europe. And again, there's more research kind of pushing in this direction. Again, a recent, I think 2016 genomics paper found that some of the individuals buried in, who died and were buried in Marseille, in the plague of Marseille, had the strain of the bacterium of a plague that they died from was an immediate descendant of the strain of the bacterium that was involved in the Black Death, which means that the plague of Marseille was a direct descendant of the Black Death of the mid-14th century. This might seem a little technical, but in historical terms, it means that you don't need to always think about an Eastern origin to explain European epidemics, right? And I'm happy to go back to this if we have more questions. And very quickly, let me just mention that the idea of a plague focus or plague reservoir is something that is, actively being pursued and studied by scientists and ecologists. And so there are new possibilities of thinking about the permanence or the persistence of plague in the natural environment. Some people have argued that it continues in salt sediments and saline environments, and especially the case of North Africa seems like that this was the case. Also looking at the case of Western US and how it persisted there, it's important to pay attention to animal hosts. So I'd like to repeat the point that, pandemics are ecological phenomena. So we can't understand them only on the basis of human agency. We need to bring in other actors as historians, we need to actively pursue the possibility of studying a pandemic as a totality. So I think I should be looking at the pathogen itself and trace it, like from the research of paleogenetics. At the same time, I should be looking at the ecology. I should be looking at the animals. I should be looking at the human host and disease interaction. So all these ecological processes that are involved in the totality of pandemics really are things that matter. So yeah, so okay, let me not get into this. We're running out of time. So the last thing that I would like to mention is, why does it matter, right? The end of pandemics, but also the narratives that are associated with these pandemics. It matters, as I said, because the pandemic narratives that had been developed during the early modern period still inform the way we think about them. So this is from my own edited volume from 2017, a piece that I published in it, Oriental Plague or Epidemiological Orientalism. In this piece, I question, or I kind of trace the development of these narratives and question where they sit in European history. Basically, what was the function of Oriental plague, and how Oriental bodies and Oriental landscapes are depicted both by narrative authors, historians, travelers, scientists, and medical doctors, artists, right? How it was written, how it was discussed, how it was imagined, the Oriental landscape as a sickly landscape, as a place where disease comes from. And, I think I also need to highlight here that, when these early modern and modern historians, historical epidemiologists, and later on modern epidemiologists are thinking about the Orient as the source of disease, as the homeland of disease, right? They're specifically talking about the Muslims, right? Muslims in the Ottoman Empire, right? Like, they talk about the Christians and Jewish populations of the Ottoman Empire, not really along the same terms that they talk about the Muslim subjects of the empire. And they say, it is because they're fatalistic. It is because they have no sense of, science. They have no sense of contagion. They did not understand any of these processes of disease, and they didn't take any precautions in the face of disease. They were fatalistic. It's all because of religious dogma. They didn't understand. So that's why disease continues in those areas. It's a trope that comes up over and over again in early modern European travel literature, but also historical and medical texts, that the Oriental landscape as a sickly space, as a space of sickness, right? And so I, in a more recent piece, I kind of situated the Plague of Marseille as a turning point for these narratives to consolidate as something that became serviceable for modern historians and policymakers, as a very, very quick kind of like jumping in time to COVID-19. And then I'll try to conclude there. When in the early stages of pandemic, when Trump called the virus China virus or foreign virus, right? Yes, it had its own political context. I'm not going to argue it wasn't, but as a historian, to me, it made reference to a much longer history, a much longer narrative that is really in the core of these narratives that start to rise during the early modern period, and then kind of got elaborated over time. And again, here I argue that Plague of Marseille 1720 just kind of the turning point, but then just kind of something that continues over and over again after that, especially the Encyclopédie of the Enlightenment, right? 18th century, it it is captured in this work. And of course, once it found its way, there's this whole narrative about like the Turks or the Muslims. The origin of the plague narrative comes up, like it finds its way into the encyclopedia, and it's just standard narrative, it becomes standard narrative. And even in artwork, we can see this as a depiction of an imaginary visit of Napoleon to the city of Jaffa. There was an outbreak of plague there, but when he heard that there was plague, he actually did not visit, but commissioned this painting to like showing himself as, like as a hero. But this, you see the contrast between the disciplined bodies of the French soldiers and the Oriental subjects here. Again, I'm happy to talk more about it, but this trope continues, the sick over time in the 19th century, of course, fitting to the political context of the 19th century. The Ottomans become the sick men of Europe, and again, just in the context of cholera and plague. So we have these depictions coming up over and over again of the sickly Orient. I think I will stop here. I probably went a little over time. I apologize.
No need to apologize at all. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you. That was wonderful. I would normally ask for a round of applause, but other than the kind of hands, if we all clap at once, it'll be terrible. That was wonderful. Thank you. So I would like to open it up to questions. And as I said at the beginning, I would very much like to kind of give the space for the first question or couple of questions to those early career graduate students amongst us. So if you don't feel confident enough using the blue hands and unmuting, then please feel free to put a question in the chat. Oh, Justine, I think was.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Professor Varlik, for your presentation. So I was interested in the field, in history, the field of the study of disease and pandemics. So is it becoming more global, or are historians still very much writing about pandemics within the context of a particular country or even Europe, or are they embracing a more global approach?
Thank you for your question. I wish I could be a little more optimistic about it, though I think I must be honest and be critical of my fellow historians. I think we're still in the 19th century. We're still thinking about we're still thinking about history as if we're still in the 19th century. I mean, you still have these like Eurocentric and colonialist narratives just being reproduced. I mean, not to kind of diminish the significance of the amazing work done by some of our colleagues, but I would like to emphasize the fact that these older narratives are so deeply embedded in the way we think and so resilient that they kind of continue across the board. And not only among historians, they kind of shape the way how policymakers think, the way how scientists think, the way how the general public thinks. So even if we kind of break some of these silos, decenter Europe and kind of have a more global approach and decolonize our historical writing, I think we still have a lot of work to do as historians to kind of change how the general public thinks about it. So I think that we are still kind of, I think we're not there yet. I mean, just today, AHM, American Association for the History of Medicine, just sent out an announcement of for the new series of events on pandemics, and I did not see a single Islamicist. Just as an example, maybe I missed it. So I want to be hopeful, but I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Dragana, would you like to go next?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Varlik, for a very interesting presentation. So you discussed a little bit about how traditionally scholars have sort of traced the pandemic from sort of the East, and we've studied it mainly in the West and Europe. And I'm curious if you know how prevalent was it in the Ottoman Empire and in the East, and kind of what effect did it have on those areas?
Thank you. Yes, it was very prevalent, and it actually lasted longer. So in fact, I don't even think that the European experience of plague is a good historical experience to study deeply, because it's something that lasted, only a couple of centuries, maybe 3 or 4 centuries, and kind of starts to recede in later 17th century from Northern and Western Europe, and then it it continued to recede from Southern and Eastern Europe throughout the course of the 18th century. So you have some small epidemics, some small outbreaks in the early 19th century in Malta, in like Southern Italy and whatnot, but just like it mostly kind of disappears from Europe, right? Whereas when you look in the Ottoman Empire, and I'm not saying the Ottoman Empire is the only place to study place, and of course, other historians can look at it in different contexts. It just, I just want to break that, Eurocentric focus. In the Ottoman Empire, at least, my research shows for the time being, I can trace a continuous record of plague from the mid 14th century to the mid 20th century. So I'm looking at 6 centuries of uninterrupted cycles of plague recurrence, right? And of course, the question is, how do we think about and the Ottoman Empire was around like from the early 13th century to the beginning of the 20th century, so very kind of long-lasting political structure, even though it goes through multiple transformations in its own historical process. But we have the same dynastic family ruling, something that resembles kind of like a continuity, even though like massive changes. So what I'm trying to say is, if we're talking about an epidemic disease that kind of on and off continued for 6 centuries in at least one part of the world that we can study it because it's so well documented, why don't we take this as our main course to study, as more main point of focus to study history of plague? Of course, we have a long way to go as Ottomanists to understand the full scale of the effects or the impact of plague, or the role of plague in Ottoman history. In my first book, I try to focus on how it kind of transformed the society, what the impact was, what were the social and political transformations that we see as a result of it. But I think the full history of the pandemic, it just remains to be written. I'm doing what I can, but it seems I'm the only one here. So yeah, but also one thing that I have to add as an early modernist, especially just the Ottoman Empire has one of the richest archives of all early modern empires in the world. I guess we could say that. It is extremely rich, and it is possible to see not only historical phenomena that we want to think as historically important, like even ecological change, and how like the use of the changes in use of land use, agrarian changes in animals, and like climate, like disease, all sorts of ecological processes. It's possible to trace them in the Ottoman archives, extremely rich. And so I'm working on this project called Black Death Digital Archive. So we managed to collect 2,000 recorded incidences of plague in the Ottoman Empire. So we are now in the process of building a website and digitizing all the data. So it will be publicly accessible, but it will also visualize all the plague occurrences in different parts of the Ottoman Empire. So we're also kind of collaborating with other colleagues to bringing data from other parts of the world. So the idea is to recreate the entire second pandemic as from historical sources.
Thank you. Wow, that's a lot of work. Maybe whilst we're waiting for more hands to go up, I might jump in and ask a follow-on question from the point of view thinking about methods. How, I mean, 600 years is massive. I fully appreciate that this absolutely needs to be done, and I think this is a wonderful project. And you talked about combining biogenetics and ecology and kind of human behavior, and I know you've talked about travel sources and visual sources and medical texts and this wonderful digital archive that you're building. Could you just say a little bit more about your methods from the point of view of how, you know, how as an historian you're approaching and dealing with such a vast array of sources over such a long period of time?
Thank you for the question. I mean, it's a struggle. I am not going to argue that I know how to do it. It's just, you know, let's see, let's try and see, let's test it. But I mean, I always find it helpful to kind of bring in different disciplines and see how we can, you know, decenter some of the narratives that are inherent to our texts, right? I mean, as a historian, of course, I was trained to work with texts, and the texts that talk about history of disease, they are a product of a cultural context, right? And, you know, most of the time they will give you the point of view of human, I mean, not most of the time, always they will give you the point of view of human actors, but most of the time, the elite urban actors, right? So, you know, that in itself is a problem to break, but then how do you break the human perspective? Like if you want to bring in, like if you want to have a multi-species, I mean, pandemics as a multi-species phenomenon, how do you go beyond the bias of written sources? I find it extremely helpful to work with bioarchaeological material. And in that sense, like bones can tell us a story that maybe will help us to go beyond the biases of our historical texts, right? And so in addition to it, like, you know, climate, you know, different kind of metrics that can help us read the environment in a way that maybe will help us to put together a story in a different way. So, you know, paleogenetics, climate science, bioarchaeology, these are all helpful tools that are now at the disposal of historians, because I mean these were not, you know, methods that were available or possible to do before, like 10 15 years ago, but now we can do it. So I'm kind of excited about these possibilities. But at the same time, like working with texts, I found it extremely helpful to use different genres and like reading different genres in conjunction with each other. That I had to do it because, especially in the 14th century, there is really not much in terms of archival evidence on plague in the Ottoman Empire. So it's, you know, helpful to look at like Venetian sources, Mamluk sources, or like, you know, what others non-Ottoman sources, you know, have to say about it. That's helpful. But at the same time, like instead of searching for documentary or narrative evidence, you know, I use like hagiographies, right? It's a very unlikely source for thinking about history of plague, because we might want to think of plague as something that is like more medical, more related to public health. No, saints' lives, hagiographies talk about plague all the time. So I guess, you know, it is possible to try to bring different genres and different methods together to deal with that problem. But that said, for like 6 centuries, like the main goal for that second book, the main question that I am trying to address, like, why did plague disappear? I mean, it didn't disappear, but why did it recede? Why did it retreat earlier in Europe than in the Ottoman Empire? And again, the standard narrative in historiography is that isolation practices, quarantine, and other public health efforts, and sanitary revolution, and all the kind of improved hygiene, urbanization, all those factors are kind of presented as if they are, as if they explain the end of plague, and but they don't, because plague is not a disease that is, you know, transmitted from person to person. So quarantine is really a historical artifact. Again, like when I say we're still in the 19th century, and just, you know, pick any book about, you know, either plague or maybe some other other infectious diseases, like in Europe, you will hear that triumphalist, narrative of Europe, the European exceptionalism, that positivistic, public health histories. I mean, in the US, we have plague in the 21st century, right? Like, this is clearly not something that is related to human progress, right? Anyway, so that's, yeah, how I will try to approach that question. 600 years will be a long time. So that's why that book has been in the making for several years.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. We have two hands up. I'm going to ask Dina to go first, just because I'm privileging graduate students. So Dina, would you like to go ahead, and then we'll come back? Thank you.
Yes. Hi, Dr. Varlik. Thank you so much for the excellent talk. I wanted to ask, I thought you did a wonderful job contextualizing the Ottoman Empire vis-a-vis Europe, but I was wondering if you could say anything, or if in your research you've come across how the plague would allow you to situate the Ottomans more to the east.
Thank you. Excellent question. The problem is, I mean, of course, there are all sorts of connections that are not limited to only human actors. So the entire kind of Western Eurasia is a very connected entity, right? I mean, like the map that we showed. So like, people traveling all the time, goods traveling back and forth, but also rodents and other animals might be just, like exchange of pathogens. So we're talking about something that is clearly not limited to state boundaries or borders, right? So in that sense, as much as there is back and forth with the West, there is more, or at least equal amount of one might assume interaction with the East. The problem is the lack of scholarship. There is not a single, let alone a monograph, not even like an article about like, what was it like in like the Timurid and Safavid Iran, for example, during the Black Death and the later, I mean, we simply don't know. And again, as an Ottomanist, I can only do what I can, right? I mean, I try to encourage graduate students to go look into that. I mean, if we have more knowledge, it will be possible to establish some of those. There's just simply no research, which is a major problem. So as you suggested, it would be wonderful to kind of establish those links, but I can't do it because I'm not a specialist. So that's a problem, I admit.
Thank you. Thank you. Are there any more graduate students who would like to ask a question before I see whether Ben still wants to ask? I know you put your hand down when you saw Dina's hand go up. Do you want to go?
Yes. What you say has really changed my understanding of the Black Death. I was somebody who's guilty of using these big arrows, and I completely accept your case that I really need to rethink here and change this. I wanted to ask you about the relationship between the events and the processes, though, in terms of pandemics and the Black Death, because I was thinking about English contemporaries writing in the late 14th century, and they're writing about pestilence as a process in the way you describe, because they're aware of repeated outbreaks. But they also write about the Black Death in the sense of the modern use of the word, that is the outbreak at the end of the 1340s. They also write about that as an event in the sense that it was different from what came after. The mortality was much higher. It affected lots of places within a relatively short amount of time. And what you've been saying today made me sort of wonder about that. Is that something that you've observed in the Islamic world too, that sort of representation of event and process, or is that another historical sort of narrative misrepresentation that's crept in?
Yes, you answered the question for me. Thank you. But first of all, I'm really glad to hear that, if you're teaching this material or planning to teach, if I convince you a little bit, that really makes me happy to hear. So that's wonderful. I didn't have time to go to all that, but I have a forthcoming article called Why is Black Death Black? And so I am looking at the creation of the myth of the Black Death as an historical artifact, as a narrative in European historical epidemiology. So the Black Death, none of the contemporaries of the Black Death refer to it as Black Death, right? The great mortality, the great pestilence, depending on like which language they were writing. But late medieval authors, and in fact, some of the early modern authors, did not think of the Black Death as a separate, different historical phenomenon or event, right? So, and then, of course, after the first wave of the Black Death, as new ones, came in, they kind of revised their historical narratives, and the character of how plague is understood as a historical phenomenon also changes over time in European historical writing. In fact, there is a wonderful new work being done on this by Laurie Jones. She's working with late medieval and early modern English and French plague treatises. And in fact, I'm co-editing a book with her. Her book is coming out soon. So that's, she's like done a lot of work with those. So I know from her research how those narratives change over time. But until the 19th century, we don't have this narrative of the Black Death as kind of like this catastrophic event that kind of dominates human history. And there is this term used, suggested by some historians at least, like Gothic epidemiology, right? This is something that you see only developing in the 19th century, 1830s, especially when cholera comes to Europe. And again, like us today, during a pandemic, rethinking an old pandemic, a German historian Hecker was, during cholera, writing about the Black Death. He is the one to use the term Black Death, I mean, in the Schwarze Tod in German, and then it was translated into English later on. And then you can see the intellectual lineage of the creation of the myth of the Black Death, first in German historical epidemiology, then in British historical epidemiology, and then it takes a life of its own. By the end of the 19th century, you have the Black Death, right? And then it's so powerful, and it just gets such a mythical, mysterious character of its own, almost ahistorical. Then it kind of erases, or kind of like, leaves in the shadow all the later epidemics of plague during the second pandemic, except for like Plague of London, Plague of Marseille. But this, like, if you see, they are referred to as the name, with the name of the city, like they refer to a location, but they're not thought is like pandemic processes, right? In any case, I mean, like, we can talk more about this when the article comes out. I'm happy to share it. So, I'm asked another question: where does this narrative come from? The Black Death, thinking about it as an event, I think it's a 19th century colonialist project. And then, of course, later on with the plague of Hong Kong at the end of the 19th century, there is no separate third pandemic. When you look at the genetics, it's the same strain of the bacterium that was involved in the Black Death that later on goes on to cause the plague of Hong Kong. It's the same disease. Why is there a third pandemic? Because, all these like colonial public health officials and epidemiologists, went to places like, British Hong Kong, British India, kind of to observe the disease on hand, and to try to control it, of course, at the same time, and then just created this new narrative of the third pandemic. Anyway, I don't want to say too much, but, I mean, I think thinking about pandemics as events is a 19th century like historical artifact that we still have it. That's why I keep saying, like, we're still in the 19th century. So yeah.
Thank you. I think we're still in the 19th century on so many levels, unfortunately, and not just in terms of colonialist narratives about plague. Are there any more questions? I have some more, but I don't want to jump in if people are waiting. Will, was that a hand? Jen?
I think I did it. Did I unmute myself?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Varlik. This was really fascinating, and it's I'm very intrigued with the idea of how to rethink how to describe pandemics, because I think any of us that do history of medicine, we've been getting a lot of questions these days about, well, how does this compare to previous pandemics? And do we have any idea of when it will be over? Right. And it's not very comforting when people ask me about the, the flu, and I say, well, of, 1918, well, it actually, really, there were still cases 3 years later. Right. So, um, but I think one of the things, as someone who does history of medicine, sometimes when I'm trying to talk about these issues, I find it useful to think about epidemics versus endemic. And so much of what you're describing to me sounds like this conflict of there's safety in describing something as a pandemic because it does have a sense of finality, like there will be a time when the pandemic is over, right? Versus thinking about endemic, when disease is endemic, then it's just there, right? And so I wondered if you could talk about that tension a little bit between how to talk about disease in and of itself. And much of what you're describing, right, if it's over 6 centuries, does that just mean it's an endemic disease rather than, and then, versus what would be a pandemic with a beginning, a middle, and an end? I just
Right.
wonder what your thoughts are on that.
No, I mean, thank you. Excellent question. So I think, again, just, definition of these terms. And again, just from the point of view of epidemiology, what is an epidemic? What is an endemic disease? When it becomes pandemic? When does it stop being a pandemic? So all of these are basically like arbitrary decisions that we as humans, as centers of knowledge, like we make, right? I mean, just as a quick example, in 1959 or 1960, World Health Organization declared the third pandemic as, ended, right? But we still have cases, right? And we still have outbreaks like the one in Madagascar in 2017. So when do you and let's look at measles, right? I mean, measles, there were no cases of, at least under control, eliminated in the US by 2000s, right? But then a couple of years ago, 2018, 2019, you have a surge in, you have epidemic, right? So, but then how many cases are how many human cases are enough to make it an epidemic? Or, I mean, what I'm trying to say, these are arbitrary decisions that we make to draw the line to whatever, but I'm not a public health specialist or epidemiologist, so I'm not, anyway. But as a historian, plague, interestingly enough, never becomes endemic, which is it's a problem because because it's not like the bacteria. I mean, humans are not hosts, so it's never endemic. So that it just complicates things because you have to look at what's going on in the rodent population, if it's endemic or if it's enzootic in the rodents, and then it kind of spills over to humans, right? I mean, it may be circulated via trade and transportation of fleas and rodents, but at the same time, even if plague is not introduced to a new city, if you have the resident host population, rats, in the wild, there are other rodents involved, but at least in urban areas, if you have enough rats in a city, they have, exactly like us humans, they have varying degrees of temporary immunity that they kind of build and lose over time. And then it seems like, the recurrences of plague kind of follows their patterns of temporary immunity. And so every 5 or 6 years, you will have in a pool of rodents large enough that lacking the immunity large enough to sustain an outbreak, you have an outbreak. So even if the bacterium is not introduced from outside, they can sustain it alive, and then it spills over to humans. So it's more complicated. And in the Ottoman Empire, when we're talking about 600 years, it never becomes endemic. It continues in outbursts, in epidemic cases. I mean, yes, there may have been cases in which like you have fewer individual cases, and those will be more difficult to track in the historical sources. Honestly, until the 19th century, like, you know, almost impossible to track down if you have like one case or two cases in a city, right? Like, you know, historical sources tend to talk more about like larger, you know, occurrences of disease. In the 19th century, it's possible because they have like a better surveillance mechanism and they do talk about individual cases, but it just still continues to happen in epidemic outbursts. So yeah, I mean, like very problematic categories, and it's I think it's difficult to draw the line, but at the same time, I think those terms also shape the way we think about past epidemics and pandemics. And so if we, you know, if you want to develop a narrative about an end of a pandemic, like, does it really end or not? So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, I don't have a good answer to that because it's complicated. And again, like end of pandemics, it's always complicated. Yeah, I guess it depends on like what you prioritize a privilege, which actor you want to privilege. If you want to privilege the bacterium or the virus, it's still there, right? If you want to privilege the host, I mean, if a zoologist is writing the history, then they might have a different approach. If you're privileging the humans, then you can legitimately talk about like end of pandemics, but it's a very anthropocentric, very limiting point of view. So, but these are just some thoughts. And if you have an input, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this as well.
No, I don't have a good answer. I just know I remember one of the things I studied was there was an outbreak of pneumonic plague in Los Angeles in 1924. And reading through the documents, it was sort of the state public health official was like, I don't understand. This was supposed to happen in San Francisco. Why is it happening in Los Angeles? And they couldn't conceptualize how rodents, right, like the squirrels and the trains, were like a perfect conduit between San Francisco and Los Angeles. It was like,
keeps moving.
it was like, really, I'm pretty sure the answer is the squirrel. But like, it just, he couldn't fathom, like, it didn't make sense to him, which was kind of fun studying because, you know, 80 years later, like, well, duh, but you know.
I would like to see that actually if it's published. I mean, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's and other people have written about it as well, but yeah, I just that's what struck me the most reading through it, is how blind the public health official was to the most obvious answer of the where it broke out in Los Angeles was right near the railroad. So it was like, well, I'm pretty sure that the squirrels hopped onto the train, like took it down south, like it was, but yeah, he could not. And I think that's the thing is, in some ways, it is use. While words can escape us, sometimes they're useful for describing these different transformations and trying to get both at the ecological as well as the cultural and social and economic aspects and how they all converge. So, but I'm in awe of you trying to put together several centuries worth of history. I don't know how you keep track of that. It's very impressive. So
it probably sounds more impressive than it actually is, but thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions?
Well, I'll just ask a brief question. I really enjoyed the talk, and especially the element of sort of you talking to us about how to displace grand received narratives and what's involved in that huge process. And I'm interested in knowing a little bit more about these bacterium and teeth as a source, and the potential that a source like that has for a more inclusive historical narrative, but also the barriers to you know, to the uptake of that source as an inclusive source. I mean, you know, a utopian view might suggest that scholars could proceed and do some sort of universal sampling, right? Because teeth are to be found everywhere, and could build some new sort of narrative on that basis. But obviously, a realist would see that there are certain constraints there. You know, I'd like to know how sources like that, like what promise they hold out for expanding the frame, and what limitations you see.
Right, thank you. Excellent methodology question, because I hope I did not present, like, you know, paleogenomics and aDNA research as a magic bullet, because it's not. But at least it's one way of, you know, one possibility to exceed or to go beyond the limitations of historical narratives. But it comes with its own baggage, of course, its own limitations and set of problems. One problem being these samples are processed in very specific ancient DNA labs, and they are different from modern DNA labs. For purpose of not having contamination of samples, they have to be strictly separated. So a lab that processes modern DNA cannot process ancient DNA. But also they require just very, you know, elaborate high-tech, you know, equipment and personnel training. So that's why you have very few of those in the world, which means that the samples from one part of the world always need to be shipped, but also shipping of human remains becomes, you know, a major, like, you know, issue. I mean, it's not easy. Some countries are more, like, you know, strict about it than others. Most of the time when there are collections contained in museums, and I should clarify that it's not only human teeth, but also animal, I mean, sometimes you have like mummified animals, or even like the skin, or like, you know, other samples can also help for testing, but, you know, for humans, teeth is basically the only place you can find plague. But the problem is you have, again, a larger representation of European samples than anything else in the world. So we have, like, basically there are only a handful of the very, very few genomes of plague bacterium that is, you know, that's been sampled outside of Europe. Still, the majority of what we have today comes from Europe, museum collections, relationships with lab as centers of learning. You still have those places dominating. And again, when, you know, I was just talking about how historical narratives, you know, are skewed, like we are reproducing the same thing. But this is exactly where I think historians matter, or the historical insights matter, because if I don't point out to this region as a historian the importance of the Ottoman Empire, like those who do the sampling or testing will not even know about it, right? They will just get the samples from museum curators or archaeologists and whatnot. And so they're like established patterns of, they don't even know they need to look at the Ottoman Empire. So I have to say that, you know, I've been collaborating with an ancient DNA lab for the last couple of years. So we have a major grant now, and we're working to, we're testing samples from Turkey and other Eastern European countries. But also there's like the problem of contamination, of the preservation of the samples, you know, how long they waited, and also depending on climate and soil quality. So there are other technical issues. And so it's never a magic bullet. It has its own limitations, but it can offer a different perspective. I guess that's all I can say.
Thank you. We have time for one, maybe two questions. I still have loads more. I'm going to be sending you a very long email, I think. I don't want to dominate this. Does anybody have any other questions? And if you don't, I'll maybe just ask one, if I may. Nilay, go ahead. Go ahead.
So thank you, Dr. Varlik. It was really wonderful. In my grad seminar today, we had the environmental history topic. So it was a beautiful coincidence. I just didn't want my question to be too Ottoman specific, but I can't help but think that like I can see how this research really changes our understanding of European history. How do you think it can help us as Ottomanists reconsider some of the established notions about the empire itself, like grand narratives? I don't want to point out the decline, but like these established notions that we take for granted about the history of the Ottoman Empire, how does rethinking the history of plague will help with that?
Thank you for your question. I mean, I would argue that there is really a lot that we can get out of this research, or at least I want to believe that this is the case. I mean, just to take a simple example of the early phase of expansion of the Ottoman Empire, 14th century and 15th century have been really like fast geographic expansion. I mean, it still continues into the 16th, but so there's always this kind of in the scholarship, you see this almost now classic argument that because the Byzantine Empire, you know, in the 14th century, after the Black Death, and early 15th century, the Byzantine population have been really badly affected by the Black Death and the later occurrences of plague, and just kind of decimated, and it was depopulated. That's why it was very easy for Ottomans to conquer this area. I mean, this was such a deeply established historical narrative that just, yeah. But at the same time, no one asked, like, were the Ottomans not affected by the same disease? You know, why does it kill the Byzantines and not the Ottomans? And the explanation for that, and again, extremely outdated, but still repeated for like, you know, decades, that the Ottomans had roots in Central Asia and plague had roots in Central Asia. And so somehow genetically they were immune. I mean, there is no such thing. Like, there is no science that supports this. And there was also this argument that, you know, because the Ottomans were a nomadic society, that they kind of, you know, managed to escape, you know, large outbreaks. The Byzantines were more urban. Again, these are just constructs, right? I mean, it's not true that the Ottomans were more nomadic at that time or less. I mean, just, you know, we at least we don't have enough evidence to show that nomadic populations were not affected by plague. Like, you know, if we even knew, I mean, there's evidence that, for example, from some Armenian manuscripts from the era of the Black Death, that plague was in a place like Divri, the highlands of, like, you know, central east Anatolia. It's a remote place, like these manuscripts from this, like, you know, just very isolated mountain monastery. Like the scribes were, like, you know, taking notes on the colophons of manuscripts about plague, like 1348. That is not an obvious place to look, but we have evidence that plague was not only in the big cities, was not only in the major urban areas, but it was in, like, even the most remote places that we don't even think were affected, but they were, right? So I guess all I'm trying to say is, you know, that narrative, for example, is very easy to take apart. But at the same time, I found it at least, you know, helpful in my own work to think about, yes, the Ottomans, you know, experienced this disease for like centuries, but let's not think of the Ottoman expansion as a consequence of lack of plague, but let's try to reconceptualize the struggle of the society, that they did this despite the plague in a way, right? I mean, what does it mean for a society to mobilize its resources and just try to maintain its army safe and kind of like launch these like complicated in pre-modern standards, like, massive movements of armies across, the large distances, and kind of the provisioning of cities. I mean, these are all, very complicated problems that the empire dealt with. And at times, because of plague, things were interrupted. I mean, you couldn't get the timber for the building of like ships on time because people would die in a city, right? You couldn't prepare, your army equipment, or you could not deliver food to a city because of plague. So all those problems were like real life problems that had to be managed and operationalized somehow, and you had to find a solution to, like, replace them or manage the resources in a way that would, I mean, it's a complex set of operations, but we never ask these questions as Ottomanists, at least, right? I mean, we want to think of disease as like, something that only had a cultural impact. No, it had an impact on like the day-to-day functioning of an empire in the cities and in the countryside, because it killed people and it killed them very fast. So we're talking about plague, and plague has, at least in the bubonic form of the disease, has levels of mortality between 40 to 60%, and in some cases higher. I mean, like, let's not even compare to COVID-19, which is not a point of comparison, but so, like, we're talking about much higher percentages of mortality. So I think it's time we take this seriously and try to kind of build in to the established narratives that we already have. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And thank you for being so generous with the questions as well. If I may, keep you all one more minute longer. I'm going to sneak just one very quick question in on behalf of about half my class from my grad seminar on the history of the body is here. And we've been talking this semester about, and I think it really, what you said really resonates with the conversations we've been having in class about how do we get past these kind of political Eurocentric frameworks when we're thinking about bodies, this whiteness, and, we're working in cultural frameworks that are constructed out of all of this. And I think you've shown really absolutely how important that is, that we keep asking those questions and we keep pushing, even if it's difficult and we don't always succeed to get beyond them, but that we have to keep. We need people like you who keep saying, and the rest of us need to embrace that and be doing that as well in our own work, who keep saying, we need to ask different questions and expand our temporal and our geographical frameworks when we're thinking about these things. And I wondered if you might just speak very quickly to the idea of the experience of bodies. So you've talked a lot about the kind of the frameworks and the politics and the kind of the movements and the geography. Could you just say something a little bit about the embodied experience of this horrible plague? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I'll try, because I'm working on an article now, so it's, exactly on this question. I'm using a color as a conceptual category to think about, the experiment, the embodied experiment of plague. And just very quickly, I guess in the early stages of the pandemic, we've heard accounts of like different difficulties of diagnosis of COVID-19 because Black and brown bodies showed different clinical symptoms. Clinically, it presented itself differently on Black and brown skin than white skin, right? And this also applies to other skin conditions. And I see in my sources, both in early modern and modern European historical and medical sources, and in the Islamic world, they only talk about plague and the appearance of plague buboes on white skin. And the plague buboes would look differently on brown and Black skin. And it's like, they always talk about, how the plague bubo becomes blue, becomes red, green. I mean, I'm thinking or trying to think about color as a diagnostic tool in early modern medical diagnosis. and trying to, you know, look at like how it is in like Europe and just trying to keep a comparative, but it's like, I think there is a very strong tradition of thinking about plague as a condition of white bodies. So, but again, in the 19th century, of course, it takes a racial character. So I, you know, I'll get back to you in a few months when I finish it. So let me just, you know, I'm working on it. But yeah, that's what I can say now, at least.
That's wonderful. I look forward to hearing more about that. Thank you so much. I've took chair's prerogative there and was a bit cheeky with that last question. So thank you very much, Dr. Varlik, and thank you everybody who stayed. That was such a wonderful and rich and fascinating paper. Thank you so much. And thank you to everybody who participated in the discussion and for your generous answers, Dr. Varlik. We really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it too. I mean, the questions were amazing. Really, they got me to think. I need to take notes before I forget them. Thank you.